I'm Michael-John Voss, one of the co-founders of ArchCity Defenders.
Thomas Harvey, one of the co-founders of ArchCity Defenders. We met in law school on the first day of law school.
That's correct.
And share a birthday in common, and have been friends throughout law school. And the origin was basically
based on our experiences working in public interest work as law students. We saw sort of the gap in services, both in the criminal side and the civil side of serving the indigent population in St. Louis, and then realizing that there were too many people and not enough lawyers to represent them in court.
Yeah.
So we looked around for a model of how to best represent people, and we came across the Bronx Defenders, which does holistic representation, and so we decided to start that here. And Thomas was bold enough to give Robin Steinberg, who ran that organization, a phone call.
Yep. She was very helpful and asked me if I wanted money from her initially, and I said no, but I wanted to take her idea and bring it to St. Louis and call it ArchCity Defenders, which I think John came up with, the name of ArchCity Defenders.
John is our other co-founder who's not here today.
And he, and John, so MJ, John, and I all worked in the clinics at SLU Law, and I did criminal defense, MJ did housing, and John did consumer law, and we just all saw the needs for the clients we were representing at that time for our other services and for social services. Right. And that's what prompted us to have that discussion. And so we started it right after we completed law school in 2009.
Had not yet passed the bar, but incorporated the organization as a nonprofit, got tax-exempt status as a charity, and just started taking cases. And it was basically pro bono for the first 3 or 4 years.
Yeah, working mostly with people who were experiencing homelessness, and that's when we really began to see the issues that the municipal courts created for people who were poor, and mostly black. Most of our clients were African American, and they told us from the very first day, this isn't about public safety, this is about me being black and me being poor, and this city wanting to raise money off of me by pulling me over at a traffic stop and jailing me and extorting my family for money.
And what we did is we just listened to them and we believed them, and then we looked at the data and it proved them true. Like, it was insane. The amount of people that were getting arrested and ticketed and over-policed and locked in jails for indefinite periods of time, all because of their poverty. And we decided we'd do a court watching project, got some students involved with that, and the end result was the white paper, which we had a draft of in the summer of 2014.
Yeah, I'd been working, so at the time we didn't really have formal offices because we were a pretty ragtag group, and I was still in part in private practice. I think you were still working?
I was too.
Still in part in private practice, trying to fund the organization and be able to pay some salaries. And so I had an office in Clayton, and MJ had an office down on the Landing. That's where most of the folks were who worked for ArchCity. But I had 3 interns: Sean Janda, Megan Cohn, and Sophia Keski, who came from WashU, and they had been willing to dedicate their summer with us, and we spent every day basically doing the research that became the white paper. Just looking at, we had done some interviews from the court watching of people at the court, and then they added the research of the data about disparity in traffic stops and the amount of revenue, which we knew to exist, but we didn't know the depths of it at that time. And so that summer, we had put it all together, and in July they left and went back to school. I think Sean was graduating, going to law school. But anyway, they were done with their summer internship, and then they came back. I came back in. I had gone on a vacation with Sheridan for a couple days, and came back into St. Louis after Mike Brown was murdered.
Right.
And we saw all the, the protest. There was this discussion of protests spilling over into other towns, which is really just Delwood, which is right next door. But at the time they said, outside infiltrators had come to spread the protest. And we saw people talking about police killings of unarmed black men. And then what we saw was media folks saying, why are you out here? I'm out here for Mike Brown. And they'd say, okay, why else are you out here? And they'd say, the police have been doing this to us for years. They've been arresting us, they've been stopping us, etc.
Right. And so we knew we had a part of the answer to that question of why here, why now, right? When African American is shot by police every 28 hours in the United States, why were people coming out day in and day out on the streets of Ferguson? And Ferguson was one of the towns we focused on in the white paper. It was Ferguson, Florissant, and Bell Ridge. And we just happened to pick Ferguson based on the data we were seeing and our own experiences as lawyers in the courtroom there. And we knew that we had part of the answer to the question of why here, why now. And the Ferguson uprising was because of people putting their bodies out on the streets, but then showing the world about what it was and why it was happening. Part of that was the white paper, and that getting circulated by news media, and seeing the stats in it, the information in it being used by Bloomberg News, New York Times, MSNBC, all of these sources, and then going out and telling our clients' stories to the media was a big part of it. And so we just did that relentlessly. That after we decided to release the white paper.
Yeah, and I remember, I think it's worth saying that at the time we were solely doing direct representation, and we had an internal conversation about whether or not we should take this position about this being a systemic problem with judges, prosecutors, cops, and the cities, because we were concerned it might put our own clients at risk. And I had 3 people tell me to do it. One was Robin at Bronx Defenders, who said judges are like bullies, and you just gotta get ahead of them, get in the news, and they'll come into line. And then the other was Sheridan, my wife, who said this is absolutely what people are looking for. What you've got is stories of real human beings in their own voice, telling what's been happening to them for years, and you should put it out there. And this data is something that a different audience will be attracted to. Mm-hmm. And the third was Nicole Hudson, who said, who at the time was not affiliated with the Ferguson Commission. There was no Ferguson Commission. Mm-hmm. And I said, hey, I've known her since high school, and I said, hey, I got this paper. It's not really done. It's not perfect. It's not polished, but it's got all this stuff. And she's like, people are desperate for some kind of context, and I think this would help. It does not tell the whole story of police killings of unarmed Black men. That's not what we ever claimed to do. We really just claimed to tell the stories of our clients, and it was definitely a part, as MJ said, it was a part of the broader context.
And then, then we started suing people, suing towns. We started filing affirmative civil rights cases, challenging illegal fines and fees, eventually filing 2 debtors' prison cases. But really one of the things that kind of got us to that level was the fact that there was an article written about our work and the white paper by a reporter named Radley Balco with the Washington Post. And he wrote this long,
50-page blog post.
50-page blog post of a news article that eventually was circulating throughout the legal communities across the country. And
in particular among 2 people.
Yeah, in particular among 2 people. But then the litigation is like what forced more and more of these towns to kind of come to the reality that things need to change. And it was in February of 2015, the 6-month anniversary after Michael Brown was murdered, that we filed the debtor's prison case against the city of Ferguson.
And Jennings.
And against Jennings.
Same day, yeah.
Right, and one of the people that helped us, that read the white paper and read that article was Blake Strode. And so that article and that white paper and the work that we had done is what brought us to his attention.
Yeah, he emailed me in, I think, September, just after that article came out in the Washington Post. Said he read it, said he was from St. Louis, and just wanted to know if there was any possibility to work at ArchCity Defenders, which of course we didn't have any money to pay.
Harvard Law.
I think even I don't think we were paying ourselves. Maybe we were. Anyway, we didn't have money to pay somebody who could be pulling down 6 figures after they walked out of law school. And I emailed John and MJ and said, we got to figure out a way to get Blake to come join us, and then emailed the board and said, drop everything else you're doing and try to raise money to get Blake to come. And then I sent a much more calm email to Blake saying, we might consider your application. No, I'm just kidding. I said, we'd love to have you, but we don't have money to pay you. Let's figure out if we can, a fellowship or something. And then we got, Blake's an amazing candidate, and got a Skadden Fellowship, and came, started the next year in September of 2015. But then also Alec. And of course now is the executive director and running the organization, and has replaced both of us, and is doing an amazing job, and everything is much better now than the previous reign. But also Alec our co-counsel
with Civil Rights
Corps,
Court.
Or
Carrick
who reached out tomato, who reached out to us after reading the Washington Post paper, or the blog post, and said he had sued some people in Montgomery, Alabama for the same thing.
Because he just started his organization.
Just started his organization, and said it was very similar and wanted to know if we wanted to co-counsel on a lawsuit. And John and I and MJ had already been talking about
drafted even a version of it, but
but it wasn't like Alex.
No.
Yeah. But yeah, we were thinking about litigation, thinking about advocacy, kicking it around, and then he emailed and called, and we were like, this guy's amazing. And at the time, we were getting emails from the ACLU and from Southern Poverty Law Center, like, Ferguson was a big thing in the news, and I appreciated it, I think we all appreciated once Alec came to St. Louis, like his dedication to the work that we were doing, and ended up co-counseling with him, and 6-month anniversary, we filed those 2 cases.
And our clients, we just basically told their stories in those complaints, what had happened to them, the days and days and days that they'd spent in Ferguson's jail, being fed substandard food in inhuman conditions, and just the size and the volume of people, because these are class actions that were impacted by Ferguson's practices and policies. And we did eventually continue to litigate both those cases. Jennings settled within a year. We were able to get, within 6 months, we were able to get injunctive relief and declaratory relief, and then within a year, we were able to get a $4.75 million settlement for a class of roughly around 2,000 people. And Blake he had joined us by that time that we had gotten to that point, so he was instrumental in getting that done and getting that finished, and kind of headed sort of our impact litigation at that point. And the sad thing is that the city of Ferguson, we're still in litigation. It's 2019. It's been 5 years. Will be 5 years this February, and we're still fighting them for some sort of sense of accountability and restitution for our clients and our class members.
Yeah, and I think the other piece that we didn't mention is in the region, people began to focus on Ferguson, and I think that our paper, which talked about Bell Ridge and Florissant, expanded that conversation and tried to accurately portray this as a broader systemic issue, because I think everyone, if you ask anyone who's practicing in the municipal courts, where Ferguson fell along the spectrum of racist and predatory courts, you'd say probably right in the middle.
Yeah.
They were not the worst, they were not the best by any stretch of the imagination, but they were also, it wasn't like Pine Lawn, it wasn't like Bell Ridge. And I think that our paper was able to present that story in a way that people then began to focus on just Ferguson as representative of that entire system.
Right.
And one of the main places where we were trying to make that argument was with the Department of Justice when they came in. We both met with them and
tried to lobby them to expand their mandate, right? They were just initially given a mandate to investigate the shooting death and then to look at the police department, but we knew that it wasn't just the police, it was the courts too, it was the town itself, right? So we pushed, they didn't expand it beyond the city of Ferguson, but we were lucky to get the courts involved.
Yeah,
part of that investigation. But
and they mentioned it in the report, but they didn't, like, what we know about St. Louis, and I think anyone who understands how power works in this country, is places like Ferguson may or may not do what the Department of Justice orders them to do, but so long as that order remains applicable only to the city of Ferguson, the rest of these cities are never going to change, because they don't think that they're the same. Right. They made it actually quite easy for them to say, well, we're not like that. And so that's why I think trying to continue to push that, the argument, and show the data and show the people's stories about how this was every city. Right. So the 10 cities we sued in December 2014, before we ever even sued Ferguson and Jennings, and then the upwards of 50 cities that have been named in lawsuits, and some dismissed and ended. But yeah, just showing that this was not just Ferguson; it was so many other places, and that it was a system that worked only if police, prosecutors, courts, judges, private criminal defense attorneys, and many other people worked in collaboration to make it work.
Yeah, and what you see now is that the litigation, although we've sued a handful of the towns in the 80 plus towns in our region, and we've litigated many of these cases and continue to push, there has been a marked downturn in the revenue being brought in. Like the town of Pine Lawn lost 98% of the revenue that it would bring in from its municipal court over the last 5 years. Ferguson alone was at $2.75 million and is now at under $300,000, right? That's coming in from its municipal court. And it shows you that, like, it's not like we got a crime wave happening. Like, this was never about public safety, right? It was about revenue generation for the towns, and it was about, as Thomas said many times, making people poor and keeping people poor, and that's what this was about. It was a form of social control, and the system has been disrupted, that system of oppression. But the problem is that it does recalibrate. It does come back.
The danger is, I think, again, people who've been working the systems know that while the municipal court revenue is down, and that's amazing, and I feel like I think we should be proud of that work, I think we have to be concerned that there's some other place that they're looking for that revenue, and we just don't know where it is right now, and that will emerge at some point. There'll be another practice that will generate this revenue
And oppress.
and undoubtedly impact mostly Black people in the St. Louis region, and it'll take a while to figure out, right? Like, that's why I think the direct representation that Arch City continues to do and the advocacy you continue to do with organizers and activists is so critical, because you're connected to it. So hopefully you're going to see it and be able to, catch it. But inevitably there will be something. I think the biggest reason we wanted the DOJ to expand their investigation was because our sense is these other places are just waiting. They're just waiting for people to stop paying attention, for Arch City to run out of resources, for whatever it is, for something to happen so they can go back to doing the same stuff that they've always done, and not have anybody be, messing up their system.
Yeah, I mean, there's been change. Obviously, you can see that in who our elected officials are these days. It's kind of reverberated, especially in the criminal justice field in our region. But even with that change, there can be problems and there can be slippage. It can come back to the way it was.
Yeah. The arc of Kim Gardner and Wesley Bell from municipal court judge, whose city we had to sue in 2015 for an illegal bail schedule, to city council member, to prosecuting attorney in St. Louis County, who's really taking some affirmative steps about change right now. But just as a reminder, like, those folks that came up in this system, that was a normal part of the legal system they came into. Now, they're not exacerbating those problems right now, but I think our goal was to rid St. Louis County of those municipal courts, and they're still there. And generally speaking, it's the same judges and prosecutors in all the same cities. Stephanie Carr is no longer in Ferguson, but now she's in Creve Coeur. Now she was in Belle Noire. She's Hazelwood still. She's still working in spite of the fact that she's been named as a person who contributed to this scheme.
Right.
And she won Prosecutor of the Year award following the year after Mike Brown was murdered. So those same folks are all still here.
Right.
I think it's got to be a culture change in order to really feel like we're past the point that this won't go back the old way, that it won't recalibrate to reproduce those same results. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if we're there. It's hard to tell if we're there, if that whole generation of people are still running the courts.
Right, and that's kind of why we're still here. We're still being, vigilant advocates for our clients in those courtrooms and day to day, and getting them connected to services and getting them, just a more stable life, right? And at the same time, we're looking at other litigation that needs to be filed, other things that we need to go after because of either the system's recalibrating or the fact that some of the actors in the past are still present, and you still see abuses. And so we've ventured into working more and more and doing work as it relates to police misconduct and police oppression. And so after the anniversary of the Stockley verdict, which came up and went, but we've filed numerous litigation lawsuits that challenges the police abuse practices from the Stockley protest, which is again an organic, sort of crowd-based, citizen-based protest that came out to protest the same things that they were protesting back in 2014. They had to do again in 2017. And so, although there's change, it's incremental, it's slow, it doesn't move at the pace in which people want to see it. And litigation is part of that change, but it's really community organizers like people like Kayla Reed with Action St. Louis and Michelle Higgins who are part of that change and part of what we're going to see going forward. And so Arch City's part of that group, part of that team, and we're working with organizations like the Bail Project, the Advancement Project, where Thomas is at now, to continue to fight for change and systemic change that's going to impact people's lives.
Just to bring it full circle to the paper, Z, you asked about like why we wrote it, and we went on a trip in 2011 to
Southern Poverty Law
Center,
Southern Center for Human Rights, the Federal Defender, and
Texas, or Alabama Appleseed, all these like amazing civil rights nonprofits that worked with people experiencing homelessness and who were indigent. And what we knew then, we had some inkling of how the system worked, but we didn't have the confidence that it was aberrational.
Right.
And they said, oh, this is worse in Mississippi, this is worse in Alabama. And then it was actually Southern Center for Human Rights that said one of the ways that they went about addressing these issues was a court watching program.
Right.
And they were super generous with us and shared their forms, and so then we came back and got SLU Law to do the court watching. And then on that trip we had structured, do the court watching, collect the results, write a paper, and what we thought then was talk to the people that ran these courts in cities and ask them to change. Like, our theory at that time was that if we
would you please
sat down with them and they told them a reasonable thing,
right,
that they would change.
That they'd be reasonable.
And by the time we got around to writing this, we knew that was never going to happen because we'd been doing it for 5 years then.
Right.
And you had that amazing experience with the prosecutor who worked for multiple cities, who told you overtly.
Yeah. No, this is about making money, and it's about making money for himself, and it's about the fact that this is a system that's set up and designed to keep people poor, make people poor, and it's intentional.
Yeah. And so at that point we knew there was no reason to go and ask these folks to change, and that we should litigate. And then over the course of time, we also began to add a much closer relationship with organizers and activists, because we also know that the law isn't going to get us there on its own.
Mm-hmm.
That really you have to have a culture shift, and the shift has got to change with the people who are most impacted by the practices. And again, we weren't perfect about that to begin with. It's been an evolution in the work that we've done. But I think now ArchCity has an incredibly close relationship with organizers and activists and continues to work with them. But we knew what was going on with people who were experiencing homelessness, and we were very committed to trying to make their lives as easy as possible and removing the legal obstacles so they could get into housing, treatment, and jobs. And that was individual direct representation. And then we saw the systemic issues and thought about litigation. And then it was organizing and activism around these issues. And now I think it's functioning pretty well, all three together. But it was not wasn't working all together at that time.
No,
we were feeling our way through it.
It was organic.
One of the things I remember hearing you mention, Thomas, in like retelling ArchCity Defenders history is how like when the Ferguson uprising started, there were people like residents of Ferguson and Normandy and Jennings who were, protesting the abusive practices of the police and the courts and the jails, the way that their rights had been violated, their dignity had been discarded. And it's like, one of the things I remember you talking about was that people had warrants out in multiple municipalities. And so when, national reporters were coming in and trying to understand what was happening and why the uprising was so strong and so important, can you just speak to the nature of like St. Louis's geography?
Sure.
So people were coming out. They were protesting in the streets in Ferguson. They were protesting not just about Ferguson, but then they get arrested at the protests, right? Because they failed to comply with an officer telling them to step back or get off the street or whatever it might be.
Or because they made up an illegal ordinance like you can't
right.
stop for more than 5 seconds.
Right, and they were making people walk up and down the street, right? And so they came up with ways of arresting people to basically scare them into submission and to stop protesting. And people were afraid because they knew that they had traffic warrants from other municipalities and other jurisdictions, and they knew that once they were going to get arrested, if they came out to voice their First Amendment rights, they were going to be put in jail, and they did not know when they were going to see their family again because they're going to do the muni shuffle, right? All of these different towns policed all of these people all the time and had you'd have warrants in multiple towns, probably just because you have one problem with your car, but you'd go through the different towns and have a ticket issued in each one of those. And so you'd have a warrant and you just disappear. and we realized like we can't just, if we're going to represent the protesters in that case, we're also going to represent them in all their other cases that they've got going on, because can't just represent them in just Ferguson. So we'd enter in on all of their cases, and we ended up doing, several dozen people that were like activists and protesters, and just defended their cases and got acquittals because of the bogus charges that they're being charged with.
Yeah, the initial reaction, one of the very first things that happened after Mike Brown's murder with respect to protest was a group threw up a webpage to raise money for a bail fund to bail out the people who were being arrested. And they would go to bail someone out who'd been arrested in Ferguson and find that person wasn't walking out of the jail that night. They were going to Jennings, right, or they were going to St. Anne, or they were going to whatever.
St. Charles.
And the bail fund didn't know, because they had never dealt with this system before. They didn't understand it, and most of the people who've been arrested, they had dealt with the system before, but they didn't know where they were going. Right. And so this bail fund then contacted us, and I've been working with an organizer there, Jeff Ordauer, trying to do a campaign on warrants, bench warrants, in the summer of 2014, before Mike Brown was murdered. And then we all got together after Mike Brown was murdered and started saying, well, we're going to shift from that and we're going to start working on getting protesters out. But it was the same work, essentially. And we had, because of our work with people experiencing homelessness, we had a real expertise about where folks were going, what it was going to take to get them out, what arguments could be made. And then working with Brendan and John at the clinics and working with Alex, just developed more and more expertise on how to fight this municipal ordinance violation tactic that had been shifted to suppress protest, right? They use the same thing that they use to police race and class for our clients, for people who are experiencing homelessness, and they use it to chill First Amendment rights. They use it to make people afraid to go out to Ferguson to protest, or the Justice Center to protest, or whatever.
Right.
And that,
yeah, no, it was something that we had the expertise in because we've been doing it for so many years. And you had all these other lawyer groups that were interested in helping, but didn't know what was going on or didn't know how the system worked. And so there were other lawyers out there that got involved that knew the system and are from St. Louis and that sort of thing. But it was sort of an organic evolution of our work from doing the work that we've been doing for the low-income homeless folks, both in the city and the county, to doing it for the protesters.
Yeah.
And I think that the holistic approach really comes through in a lot of different ways over the years. And one of them is when you talk about representing protesters on their municipal tickets and things like that, and then defending them when these towns like Ferguson are prosecuting them like they're the most dangerous people in America on these alleged failure to comply and these petty municipal charges, and then taking that a step further and filing malicious prosecution lawsuits in addition to this wave of the fines and fees cases. And I'm just wondering if you can speak to that, and also the ways in which you valued centering client stories in news media narratives, because most law firms choose to not comment on pending litigation. So if you could talk about that.
It's an active decision that was made about being very vocal for our clients.
Yeah, including a decision about me not going out to municipal court anymore, because I was talking about those stories, and so I didn't want to be talking about someone I represented. I also was attacking that system, so it didn't make sense for me to keep going to court and stand in front of those judges whose system I was attacking. Right. And it gave you all an easy way to say Crazy Thomas.
That's just Thomas's opinion. But it was ours. But we definitely, it was a conscious decision that we were going to make that sort of division in terms of the work. And then it made sense because of the fact that we have to be advocates first and foremost for our clients, right? And we'll do that in the courtroom. But we also know that there's the court of public opinion, and that is what matters as well. Yeah. And so being an advocate for them in the media and with the media is an important part of our work, and always has been.
And I mean, you went on Democracy Now! With Allison and Herbert, right? Like, it wasn't like it was just you or me talking.
With our clients.
To the extent it was possible, we wanted our clients to be able to talk about their own experience.
Samantha.
I do think, we ran into that standard, lawyer question of what are the ethical implications of having a person talk to the media about a case that's still pending. But the truth is, many of I do think this is an important question, because many of the lawyers who sought to represent protesters didn't want their clients talking to the press. And that's a decision everyone has to make, but it's the client's choice about whether or not they want to tell their story. And so many people, especially people who've been damaged by that system for 10, 20, 30 years, they wanted to tell their story. They wanted to be able to say, this was a racist system, this was about my race and my poverty, not about public safety. And if they every once in a while mixed up a detail about a jailing, I think our position was, and I think the reality is, that is an illustration of the normalcy of jailing people for their poverty and race in this city. In other contexts, it may be unique to have been jailed one time, but for the people that we've been working with, that's a 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times a year being jailed. So do you know if you were in Ferguson or Jennings?
That's right.
The question is, what time of the year was it? Was it cold outside? Was it hot outside? And I don't know. I mean, I don't think we ever really had a problem with that, because much more important than our litigation was the advocacy. Yeah. It was the human stories of people bouncing from jail to jail for weeks on end. It was Nicole in a jail cell in St. Charles with a heroin addict throwing up in her cell, and Nicole having to clean it up. That moved people to say, why is this person locked in a jail, away from her kids for a month?
Well, because she's too poor to get her car fixed.
Right.
Right. That's not what we want when we want.
That's not justice.
That's not justice. And so it was pervasive, and it just impacted so many people's lives. And so, and this is an anecdote. Like, when the media did come after Ferguson started, and one of the things that they said is like, why are people now just getting, aware of this? And Thomas's best response to that, well, it depends on what you mean when you mean people.
Yeah.
Right. Because it's about the people that haven't been listened to. Right. And they've been shouting and screaming about the abuses that they've suffered and complaining about it. And government hadn't listened. People in power didn't care. And so, it was about shifting that dialogue and getting the people that were impacted, the impacted person's voices out as best as possible if they wanted that. And that's what we did.
Yeah, for poor people and black people in this region, there was nothing new about that system. If they had been locked up, their family member had been locked up. Same thing with the workhouse today, right? Like, people have been in the workhouse if they live in the city of St. Louis and they're black, that they have or their family members have. Not even as a result of having committed a crime, but having being alleged to have committed a crime and being arrested and been sitting there on bail. Same thing with the municipal legal system. It was only for people who, live in West County, like white middle-class folks in St. Louis didn't have to know this system existed because they weren't subjected to it. Because for most people, if you got a $150 traffic ticket, you just pay it. Or you pay a lawyer to get it amended, and you never went to court, you never sat in jail. That never happened.
And also, sorry to interrupt, but like white people, we know from our client stories and through so many different, through especially the Missouri Attorney General's office data, that there are major racial disparities in who is getting stopped, right? And so,
yeah, no, I mean that was in the paper too. I remember seeing that quoted in the DOJ report, but not referencing not the paper, but the AG's report, right? Like, we didn't crunch those numbers.
No, we would.
That was in a
government
annually published report on racial disparities in traffic spots that had been published every year since 2000, and every year it was getting worse.
Right.
And I think initially we read that they used to have a press conference and publicize this, and then they saw that the data kept getting worse, and they're like, we should just really. Now, to Schmidt's credit, to current AG Eric Schmidt, he's now having that press conference and talking about it a little more honestly. Right. But for a time, that data was out there. The warrants being issued was out there. The revenue was on Ferguson's website. It was on Florescen's website. It was on Bell Ridge's website.
Right. And it's compiled by the State Office of State Courts Administration, so you can look at every single jurisdiction and every single municipality and see what they're doing, and you can track it from year to year. And we have been. And we actually are going to come out with a new white paper that's going to address and talk about the changes and reforms that have happened, and what the data says. So.
Yeah, anyone could have brought those cases before 2014. Anyone could have done this advocacy before 2014
if they just listened to
if they were listening and taken seriously. I think there are good lawyers out there who are listening and taken seriously, but who didn't think like a full attack on that system would be successful. And maybe it wouldn't have been in a different political context, but at the time, the state and the powers that be were much more receptive to a conversation about courts than they were about police. And I don't think that should be overlooked. Like that was something that, again, data about the drop in revenue from $60 million in 2013 to $22 million in 2018
Region-wide.
overall region-wide in the municipal courts is an incredible number. It's also still way too much.
Right.
$22 million to collect from people for traffic stops, but it's an incredible number. And the cities where the most progress is made is the cities where ArchCity Defenders sued.
Right. And also those are, even the cities we haven't sued, you've seen that they've changed their policies to a degree, and the numbers have gone down. Also, there's nobody sitting in jail anymore in the county as they were.
That's
they're getting
incredible.
new court dates
Yeah.
released. They're given the due process that are afforded under the Constitution, and they're not just being held indefinitely because of their poverty. That stuff has stopped. Now, it doesn't mean that they've been made whole for the
Right.
past abuses in the past, and that's why we continue with the litigation. That's why we continue to push with our cases and investigate what's going on. And it doesn't mean that they can't always slip back into those practices if you don't get, a
Yeah,
federal
those
court
jails
order.
are still there.
They're still there.
They didn't close their jails and tear them down.
No. So that's, we're still doing this work. We're still doing the advocacy work. We're working on a new white paper that we hope to release soon this fall.
Probably won't be called a white paper this
It won't be
time.
called a white paper. Some other name. Our director of advocacy, Jackie Langham, has a good idea of what that's going to be called.
Okay.
So,
Good.
yeah.
Good.
All right.
Okay, anything else you guys want to add?
No.
I don't think so. It's a little sprawling.
Yeah,
Do you think we should
No, this is great.
talk about something else more directly?
Are we still recording?
It is still recording. This is so great. We needed to do this for so long. This is like
Cool.
Good.
literally, it's great. I wanted to just make sure you felt like you covered, I felt like you did it really gracefully in the way of like,